morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I guess it's good evening for most of you. I appreciate the privilege of being here again today with Margaret's great community, Lady Margaret, as I call her. And the subject today is, I think, one that interests me a lot, and that's the return on investment that can be leveraged out of people, processes, and tools by focusing a little more on the people part of it. So I'll begin the lecture with a definition of a quality culture. A quality culture does what the customer wants or what he or she needs or expects. And it creates reasonable expectations of feeling safe and secure. And it creates a perception of trust and reliability in the promises that are made for us, a product or a service of some kind. And you can see that these are interactive between the customer, stakeholders, the deliverer of the service or product. That and I heard Kerstin emphasize the trust factor. Trust has to be built up between the customer and the stakeholder and the providers, and it's based on experience. If you have good experiences, trust goes up. If you had bad experiences or you have error rates that interrupt the usability of the experience, then they go down. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be related to the quality culture that delivers the product or service. Over my lifetime, and I notice a lot of graybeards on the phone today, I'm sure on yours as well, we've seen a lot of technological super systems develop. My first experience was on the Apollo program. You've heard that if you've spoken to me, heard me speak before. But I've just really greatly enjoyed all of the different things that have evolved over the last 20 or 30 years in particular, from transportation to production and distribution and so on and so forth. And one of the things that has always been a cornerstone of the work of highly technical environments that I've known that were successful is being able to have average people perform at high levels in a complex super system. When you think about some of the projects, they are so complex. They require so many, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, that you've got to figure that you don't have high performing people in every slot and every job description, but you can have highly effective people that are performing to the requirements and exceeding them. And so one of the first things that we learn is to verify our work systematically. And this is something that's done or acting according to a fixed plan or system. In other words, being methodical. And so it's very common for us to learn how to verify the inputs into a process and then validate the outputs on the outside of it, and to do it with rigor and due diligence, to take it seriously. Early in my life, I had it emphasized the importance of conforming to the requirements and avoiding errors because of the potential harm not only to the project or to the process, but to the people involved. And that I should focus a lot on the people involved and not forget that. And also to concentrate on providing the best people available. Now, it might be an average person functioning at a high level because of training and assistance and so on and so forth. But the best person available should be in each slot if you want the entire chain of human beings to work properly. Once you get your individual module or your individual project that's part of the overall super system functioning and tested, then you have to test it against the entire collaborative system. So you're not only verifying inputs and validating outputs, but you're verifying connectivity, that the interactions are there, that the communications support the required activities that you've designed. So I grew up in this environment. I've seen it mature over my lifetime in really spectacular ways. And, you know, I'm not talking about just the advent of telephone communications and up to, you know, the little computers we hold in our hand now called cell phones. There are all kinds of ways that technologies have evolved to support the human effort. one of these that I like to talk about a lot is like Tesla's Gigafactory. And I remember when I started reading, and I noticed, Tom, you're an expert on Musk. He's one of my interesting and favorite engineering type people because he's a real physicist. He understands these things. And when I read and saw some videos on the gigafactories, I thought, what an enormous leap forward in thinking and application of engineering principle. There are a lot of others that aren't that heavy into the manufacturing and iron and steel, as we used to say. But when you think about Amazon and even the health systems that we have now, they've advanced their ability to deliver products and services around the world on a global supply chain in a way that's just spectacular. As they've done that, there have been a number of developments in the marketplace focusing on new methods, new technologies that have tremendous promises attached to them. And as I just said, and as you've seen yourself, they often have very high positive outputs, so a great return on investment that accelerates an entire economy in a nation or on a continent or even globally around certain products and services. From time to time, they fail. And interestingly enough, when they fail spectacularly. They're not just heralded in the media as failures. They're heralded in the households that depend upon it, or the businesses that depend upon that supply chain of services or products. And we find often that when that happens, the interested people, the ones that are controlling and managing the processes, have failed to properly apply the merit metrics that were required to anticipate failures. And if they had the facts, they were so busy trying to expand their business and improve their market share that often they were racing past the facts to get an outcome. And so an engineer sitting back calmly looking at the data, and as I say often, not through a straw, but through a global view, would have anticipated the failure and would have been able to mediate the failure. But often these things appear to slip up on us. And society says, gosh, how did that happen? I mean, it must be so complex. No one can possibly know that what those of us who are in the business world and engineering world would say, no, it was visible and it was coming, but we ignored the facts as we were so busy doing other things. One of my favorite examples, and Barclay and I have shared this particular slide many, many times, is the argument about the development process, the use of agile versus waterfall, for instance, techniques. And I remember when I first heard this a number of years ago, and agile was on the rise and everything, and I thought, wow, somebody said in a meeting, agile is 3.5 times more effective than waterfall, and I thought, whoa, I didn't know waterfall was that lousy. Because on my understanding is that agile was repeated iterations of waterfall, sort of, and I thought, well, when I got into this study, and this is a study from the Standish Group, I found out that agile works 3.5 times or a little bit more than that than waterfall, and it's effective 39% of the time. It delivers on time, on schedule, and on budget. I am not impressed. And I actually said in a meeting, I think Barclay might have been there, if I ever walked into the engineering office back at the Cape when I was a young sprite of an engineer and said, I've got the best idea, you're not going to believe how, and it works 39% of the time, I'd have been thrown out of the industry. I've been blackballed. And yet all of this celebration goes on because it was literally, as I've evaluated it over time, and you can have your own opinion, I think it was an attempt to solve the people problem with process, with new terms, with sexy little things to do that basically replace the lack of discipline, the lack of vocational certainty that was beginning to evolve in our business world. So the Standish Group wasn't a small study. They do about 50,000 projects a year, and I haven't seen the most recent studies. But Agile properly implemented provides really good, highly accelerated and reliable development process. And what this data proves, it's not the methodology. It is the processes and the people are failing. And when you look at most of them and see the documentation of the process, you have to assume the people are for some reason not following those or are unable to follow those. There have been all kinds of advancements. I could go on and on. I like this Jenny Romiti of IBM. Romiti, is it Romiti or Romiti? Anyway, and this goes back a while where she said, look, we're working on AI, we're working on quantum computing, we have all kinds of advanced analytics and all kinds of things that provide rapid, detailed guidance for a person. The emphasis here is guidance. Robotics provide reliable work capacity, and they're an assist, they're a methodology. But all of the technologies that we're working with are designed to augment human intelligence, not replace it. To leverage what we're able to do, to speed it up through the aggregation of data and the analysis of data and so on. And I think as we've moved along in the last couple of decades, we've slowly started to lose track of that to the point that sometimes we think that technology will solve the error rates, will solve the problem of accelerating and multiplying our supply processes. There are helps. There are things that in the hands of a competent, vocationally certain human being are valuable tools. Well, let's talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities of these super systems that we're relying upon, whether it's bringing us household goods or military products or automobiles, transportation, communications. And these are American stats here, but they do have worldwide data on these. And first I want to talk about the Gallup poll. I've been following the Gallup poll since I think about 2016 or 17 on the state of the American workplace. And, I'm a bit of a study on this. And what I found out was, and this was the first time I read it, that 70% of the people in the workplace either hate their jobs and are disengaged or actively disengaged. Now, that varies from state to state because they've been able to drill down and give us individual stats over the last few years. And it varies from state to state in the United States, from country to country on the European continent, from between disciplines, everything from physicians to plumbers, craftsmen. But they don't vary very much, a lot each year. It was 70%, it's gone to 71, it's dropped to 67. And as you know, those could be polling errors, but they're large samples. And so about 30 to 34% of the workforce is engaged, productive, positive, and producing things in conformance to the requirements of both the process and the environment. That's not a large number. And when you think about the way our economies, global economies have been expanding, it's sort of miraculous that we're still working. Sometimes my wife will say to me, why don't these things work better? And I'm saying, well, it's sure not the design process, and it's sure not the lack of technology assist. It has to be something else. Oh, you think maybe it might be that the people aren't as prepared as they've been before? Well, here's another example. The American Institute for Research did some studies and found that people with a 4-year college degree, now this is all US, so those of you in Europe can probably preen a little bit and say we're a lot better. And I have some colleagues who can verify that, of course, that 50% of American college graduates with a 4-year bachelor's degree could not pass a fundamental basic literacy exam. That means they couldn't read a paragraph and effectively tell you what the topic of the paragraph was. And on the math side, the logic side, if you handed them a menu and said, here, tell me how much a hamburger and a salad would be off of this menu, they couldn't do it without computing it on their phone or something. If you gave them a can of beans and said, this can of beans costs $1 and it's 10 ounces, how much is it per ounce? They could not do it. Now, we're talking about 50% of the educated people coming out at bachelor's level. This jumps to 75% for 2-year college graduates. And guess where a whole bunch of our people in the IT world come from? They come from that 2-year school. and they're self-taught and so on and so forth. Now, generally, we have more motivated people in this field, but the statistics don't lie. This is a terrifying example of a vulnerability within our systems that are all about humans. And that's where the greatest return on investment really comes once you have the technologies in place. There's no doubt whatsoever that technologies leverage and rapidly accelerate the return on investment. If that weren't true, we wouldn't have used them and developed them and advanced them as we have. But what we're leaving behind is the importance of the human being. One of the reasons, and one of the places we can change that, is in the educational process. Some people have never heard of Bloom's taxonomy. I know all of you that are educators for sure have heard of Bloom's taxonomy. And basically, this is a breakdown of how people learn and how they retain and how they apply knowledge. So you can see the first thing you do is recall facts. So you study, you read, you listen to things, and the requirement is to remember them. Then the next level of requirement is to understand them. And you know yourself when you've studied, I remember studying and highlighting books and doing this and that. And I could remember them before I could necessarily understand them. And then over time and discussions and application, I began to apply them more effectively. And then I could get to the point where I could look at this information or this field of study or this discipline and start to analyze it. And it was funny how things start to clear up and gel. And all of a sudden, you're able to evaluate it and criticize it in effective ways to improve it. And we go from there to real creation. And it's interesting because I've had a lot of interactions with academics. And one of them said to me one day, in fact, it's more than once, but I remember the original time, and they said, we really want to get past some of these steps and get to the creativity and the higher levels of assessment. We want to know how the acquisition of information has affected the person, the reader, the learner, and how they feel about these things. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, but myself, I could care less how they feel until they prove to me they know that they've gone through the steps of reading, remembering, understanding, applying, and so on. They can jump a couple of steps after that if they're brilliant. But I want to make sure they have the facts right, that 2 and 2 really is 4 to them, that they haven't lost their logic powers by failing to do the math. So this is an area that's gotten a little slack, a little too flexible, and it shows up when people get into the higher education categories, choose a discipline and find themselves unable to effectively communicate in a classroom, whether it's live or remote. Here's another example of the problems and the costs associated with this. This is a breakdown of some of the data from the Gallup poll. It's very interesting because you see, and this will be in the slide pack I've already sent to Margaret, the categories of actively disengaged, disengaged, and engaged workers. One of the things that's interesting is 16% on average of the workforce is actively disengaged. And when you read down this column, I'm not going to do every column, you find that they're actually involved in subterfuge and dead-ending people, doing very actively, sometimes destructive things to the process. 16%. At the very least, they're so angry or frustrated, or some studies show, and you can follow just do some research on the internet on this. It's jealousy based sometimes, it's insecurity. It doesn't matter because they're acting in ways that are contrary to the fulfillment of the requirements. And I was listening to Kerstin and talk about a diversity problem. Okay, now we've got all the normal factors for diversity and unifying workforce, but when you get people that are operating at this level for some reason, it gets very, very difficult. But look at this, look at some of these numbers that have come out. Now, these have been evaluated by the American Management Association, by Gallup, by McLean and Company, by Purdue University. The numbers are amazingly consistent. In Europe, oddly, they're slightly higher in some areas of Europe, but the variance is not significant. So this is a global problem. Gallup and Purdue said, when you have engaged employees, you get 17% higher productivity, 21% higher profitability, 58% lower turnover, 58% lower turnover, 41% less absenteeism, and so on, and including theft and shrinkage. Those things start to disappear. So you can see that the problems that they're trying to overcome that are so difficult in America's and the global workforce, and Europe is not exempt from this. In fact, with the complications and the variables of culture, as Kerstin was pressing on a little bit, it has to be more difficult to manage in these economies. So we can't ignore the human aspect of this. When we do, our return on investment then begins to focus on, okay, how can we improve another technology? How can we do this? And I found a general reluctance among leadership, and particularly managers of multinational corporations, to engage in the problem of improving the people part of the formula. Super systems must be supported by intelligent systems where the people are the major asset. It just happens that the author of that quote is here on the screen in front of me, Dr. Barclay Brown. We were at dinner one night having a discussion, and he coined this phrase, and I've been using it and quoting it as my right arm, because it really is the fact that we've gotten to the point that we don't realize that the human factor is not essential, not just important, it's essential. And he used early on what he called the Kasparov effect. Garry Kasparov, the famous chess champion, challenged Big Blue, and back then Barclay was working for IBM, and we got a lot of fun out of this with our IBM colleagues. We had some cohorts that worked together on a regular basis, and so Garry Kasparov beats Big Blue. He beats the computer. And so the guys get together and say, well, that ain't right. So we'll take all the moves Garry made and put them on the computer, and we'll go back, and they beat him. And he said, well, I can play that game. So he got his own computer, put his own algorithm together, input his own data, and pounded Big Blue, which proved beyond question over time, as a person who's vocationally certain, competent, and has the right ethics with the right technologies is greatly assisted by the technologies, and greatly assisted by their own experience and knowledge base. They're not nearly as effective when one is prioritized over the other in such a way, especially that you depend on the technologies. It's time for a journey back to digital reality. So much of what we've seen and experienced, you don't want to be the old man saying, get off my lawn, that kind of thing. But there are some things that we see that just don't make sense, because we can look at the error rates, we can look at various social reactions and financial reactions, things in the marketplace or in the stock exchanges and the trading. There are signals in the economy that tell us we're stretching the rubber band just about as far as we can on this interface between people, processes, and tools. So it's time to get back, I think, to a sort of cultural retransformation of pairing reliable people and the right technologies in an intelligent system. And it's an adjustment that is very easy to make as long as you have reliable people. It's time to balance out technologies and technologists. It's time to balance out decision makers with implementers, like DevOps, back and forth, who's going to win the argument, and work processes with work culture. In the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, I got to work in 80s and 90s and through the early 2000s when he passed. I spent a lot of time with Philip Crosby. He was a friend, a mentor, and more than that. We were very involved in a lot of things together. And he said, quality is the result of a carefully crafted cultural environment. It has to be the fabric of the organization and not part of the fabric. You notice he didn't say a thing about the technologies or the quality control methods. He emphasized, and of course, he was an expert, as Deming was, and Juran and others. He emphasized that the culture has to properly support the technologies, the methods, quality control, quality assurance, and so on and so forth. And Deming did the same thing in his 14 points. Now, I mention them because they're two of the 3 or 4 leaders worldwide for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They stand out because they turned the ship at a time when it needed to be turned. And they emphasize the importance of the culture, because without the proper culture, without the proper workforce that is aligned and synchronized, so to speak, or integrated properly with the technologies as a process support, you get these strange variables. And it's funny, if you watch them over a 10-year period, you'll see things peak, then drop, then level off, then peak, then drop. And of course, the curve has been continually going up. So our productivity worldwide is up. The number of products and services that we distribute is up. And in some cases, reliability is even up. But then these strange turns take place. And it's kind of like I was talking to one of our friends in the systems engineering quality management group about cybersecurity. And I said, you know what? I think it's true. And he was an expert and he verified it, that 99.9% of all cybersecurity failures in major organizations are assisted by the failure of a human element. Somebody gets compromised. Somebody makes a horrendous error, and so on. And so you track all these things down, and it goes through the gate of the human experience. In Deming's 14 points, he emphasized the need to create constancy of purpose for improving products. And it should be supported by a vigorous program of education and self-improvement for everyone. I mean, these are words that were kind of, well, so what back then, because the youngsters coming out of high school and college back then, honestly, as the data proves, didn't have the large gaps of education that are there now. And so talking about self-improvement for everyone was kind of like, well, of course, you know, if you're in a technical field, you want to do that. Now they're an alarm. My work on the 8 attributes of a quality culture was implemented in the Systems Engineering Handbook of NCOSE with Barclay's help, as a matter of fact, and leadership. And one of the things that is now starting to be recognized is that Deming, Crosby, and those folks that worked with them set a standard that we haven't followed, that we haven't built upon. People are dynamic, the cultures are dynamic, and you have to keep up with them in language and behaviors. And I saw where Niels had emphasized that earlier today. And so it's a little myopic and naive to think that you can advance in the large strokes that we have established for our marketplace and not have to make adjustments for the human element and even updating the technologies. We spend money on technologies, but the real return, the big jump and return on investment is in the people. I'll take a moment to review the 8 attributes in just a few minutes to review the 8 attributes that I'm talking about. The first is a zero defects attitude, which is different than a zero defects target, not performing at high levels of error rates. We're not talking about perfection. It's a commitment to keep our promises. And basically, it relates to pride of workmanship. You know, is there a pride in the workmanship that attaches to you, your team, your division, your company, your industry? It used to be you could go to an association meeting and you could name it, trucking, mop building, anything you can think of, and then have an association. There would be a session or two or an emphasis on the pride of workmanship, the importance of what we do, where it fits into the economy, where it fits into the social structure, how it supports the human experience. And pride of workmanship is very rarely a term you hear anymore. You do hear it, and particularly in our fields, from time to time from some of those with more experience, because we see a drift away from it, where the individual is at such an arm's length. There's code and things like that between me and the person I'm serving, that we lose the impact of what an error does on the individual when I make a mistake or when I am not as diligent or as rigorous as I need to be. There are two elements or two attributes or values that we consider to be the twin towers of a quality culture. The first is a zero defects attitude. The second is vocational certainty, which is a measure of our faithfulness to our career agenda. And by that, I mean education, training, experience, and so on. That it just doesn't come out of the head, it comes out of the heart as well. Do you care? Are you engaged? And have you been incentivized to and reinforced on those, or have you been de-incentivized by the lack of understanding of how to manage a culture, the importance of the individual and the group, and so on and so forth. And then there are these others that are more the professional qualities, how to manage a process for quality, administrative consistency, executive credibility, personal authenticity, and whether or not you're the same person at work as you are at home with the people out on the floor or way up in the executive suite. Are you the same person? Do you have the same viewpoints? Or are you switching? Are you duplicitous? Are you manipulative? Are you inconsistent? And these are things that were not that often codified in books and lectures and stuff, but I've noticed the necessity of people to start doing that, and they very carefully, tenderly walk into the area of ethics. And so these are things that are all part of what some people call the common sense world of business, the common sense world of technology development. And sometimes they have to be codified, as we've done with the 8 attributes, to just remind people. And the greatest effect that I've noticed is not to teach them something they haven't known before, not just to remind them, but to affirm them in values that they already held, but that were being challenged. I noticed a story in the news just yesterday of a tragedy, a serious tragedy, and the individual involved in the criminal act was someone who had been minimalized and isolated and treated poorly and de-incentivized to participate in it and function in a positive way in society. If you think about it, that goes on a lot in business cultures, and it may be an explanation for that 16% that we know exists. There are probably a lot of factors, but that could be an important one. And so we emphasize these 8 attributes as an important cornerstone of the knowledge we need, the values we need to share, back to Kerstin's points, and how we can work together to be more effective and raise our level of not just productivity and output, but the accessibility and the usability of our products. Because the more safe, the more reliable, the more relatable the products are to our needs, that's when we have what's such a high priority today, and that is sustainability. You can sustain growth and progress when those things are in place. This is a graphic of a complete quality culture, and you see a quality culture is both skills and values. Now think about this just a minute, and you can, like I said, do your own deep dive on this, or come to our next cohort. Margaret will tell you about being a part of that. You can have values that are expressed through skills, and you can have skills that are supported by values. And when you have those, you have a more complete culture. But to have a reliable culture, you can't just have skills. You've got to have values. And you've seen a lot of skills-laden, skills-rich environments that turn out to be questionable in their ethics and their reliability. A friend of mine used to say, you can make an able man capable, and you can and move them into more productive things, but you can't make a person reliable. They have to be reliable. You can incentivize it, you can encourage them, you can teach them, and so on and so forth. But if someone has come through, particularly like we say, our training and rejects our values, we go, so what? I mean, as someone once said to me just not too long ago at a major academic institution, the person said, well, if a person doesn't like these 8 points, what would they like? If they won't agree to something this clear and simple, what would they agree to? Because we're not talking about a person's private ethic what they do in their private life. We're talking about what their ethic is and what they will conform to and adhere to in the process. The process ethics. Are you going to be authentic in this situation? Are you going to be, and we talk about vocational certainty, are you going to govern yourself more than you need for us to govern you? So the culture is made up of skills and values. We need to teach skills and we need to affirm values, because a lot of people feel muted by standing up and saying, well, I don't find in this meeting that we're having here that we're all operating in vocational certainty. Well, how do you express that? Well, we have an icon at the Quality Management Institute, and it's Mr. Guessing What. And Mr. Guessing What, you've met him. He gets up every day guessing what to do next and trying to avoid accountability. And he has to sort of wing it, fake it, stretch in meetings. And out of that comes rabbit trails and confusion and conflict. And so we need to make sure that every individual in our process is empowered to speak what's necessary to improve that process and to support an accurate acquisition, I started to say accurate acquisition of the requirements and the implementation of them. So this is what happens when you have a complete QM culture. You have the values that are required and the skills are required. And when they're properly implemented in a corporate environment that supports those with protocols and other enablements, you get all of these wonderful things on the right-hand column here: continuous improvement, delighted customers, engaged high performance, all the things that we want and that we experience a lot of the times when we're in environments that take serious the importance of connecting the requirements of the customer or stakeholder with what we're doing. So where's the return on investment? There's a return on investment on technologies. There's a return on investment in developing better, more well-defined processes. And there is an equal or greater return on investment when we spend the time and the money and the effort to provide vocationally certain people to participate in that process. The truth is, almost all things are possible when you're working within a real quality culture. Average people, properly paired with the right tools and processes in an intelligent system, can do really, really great things.